The idea that governments, rather than creating debt, can create as much money as they see fit to invest in the economy and to create jobs, that's all fine, but does it work in the international sense when you deal with money that's not from your country and when you are not in America and your currency is not the world's reserve currency? Today we ask the question, is modern monetary theory, which is what this is all about, too closed to survive? Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Now, we have touched on modern monetary theory a few times, but we're going to spend a bit more time on it today, and in particular, how it's influenced by foreign trade and foreign currency. So let's start, Steve. Let's just a quick recap on what modern monetary theory, or MMT, is. The argument is that government spending shouldn't be related to income from taxation, that governments can create money. They issue bonds through their central bank, for whatever the country needs, motorways, health, education, whatever it is, so long as they're buying things in their currency. But that happens if you live in a closed system, because the governments can create their money. They don't need taxation, except, of course, if they create too much money, that could create runaway inflation. So you stop. You don't create too much when you get to full employment. And I guess for many people, that is the aim, isn't it, of modern monetary theory and for government policy. If you don't have, you aim for full employment. And if you don't have full employment, then that is because the government is restricting the supply of money, and that is the cause of it. Have I summarised all that work quite well in about 1 minute?
Reasonably. This is the fundamental appeal of MMT is that it's, first of all, looking at the monetary side of the economy. It's an accurate statement of the accounting realities of how money is created, and that is the basic double entry bookkeeping is a fundamental part of that vision. So if you look at the government as a money creator, and it's one of the organisations apart from banks which can actually create money, both firstly by having a spending exceeding taxation, and secondly by that being backed by the central bank buying more bonds than it sells. Which then converts part of that deficit into new money. Then yes, if you have a lack of money in the economy, you can create it by government increasing its spending. And
this goes back. Keynes really was the first to allude to this, wasn't he? In the treatise on money, and but then it's been picked up. Bill Mitchell, I guess, at the University of Newcastle in Australia, he's the guy who coined the phrase modern monetary theory, and he and his brigade have given it life, I guess.
Yeah, and it's actually, if you want to go back in the history, it goes back to people like Aberlour. I've forgotten his first name, but Eccles, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve during the Second World War and the early part of the post-war period. They were the ones who began to realise, largely through America's practice during the Second World War, was that it wasn't a lack of money that constrained output. It was a lack of resources being either created or employed that existed at the time. And with the large scale of government spending, you could actually mobilise those resources. And coming back to it, the actual financing of it ended up being one of the easiest parts, because the simplest way to do it is to say that the government is the only institution in society that owns its own bank. And when that bank issues its liabilities, which could be money, physical cash, or putting money in people's bank accounts, and you transfer it to somebody else, that person accepts that transfer in full settlement of the debt you have, and therefore what is happening is the government's promises to pay are accepted as a means of payment between third parties. And if you therefore have a government producing not enough promises to pay, then you can actually end up having unemployed resources just because the government hasn't created enough money.
But it's a very difficult argument, isn't it, to hit people with, because it goes against conventional thinking that, governments tax, they get the money in and then they spend that money, and people might accept that, well, okay, you can make a loss, you can have a deficit when the economy's down because we know you're getting less money in and you need to spend more outwardly to try and boost the economy. But the idea you might do that on an ongoing basis, most people would just say, well, this is just an excuse for reckless spending by the government. The idea that taxation is meaningless, that it's there just to control inflation or to manage the distribution of income, it doesn't actually impact how government spends. People will just go, well, what's the controls on government in that case? They can just go mad with money.
Yeah, and that's often the argument. You get MMT, therefore Zimbabwe, and you find yourself trapped in a discussion about cases of hyperinflation, which have I think universally occurred when there's been a collapse in physical resources to begin with. And the MMT does talk very cogently about that. It's something, hyperinflation is something that I haven't studied myself. I've got my opinion of it based on what I know roughly about the Weimar period in Germany, but by nowhere near enough to actually make the sort of commentary I like to make. But yes, that's what's happened. They get this, the MMT, therefore Zimbabwe. Now, what the MMT group argue back is that we are describing the actual mechanics of the monetary system. You might not like it, but these are the mechanics. And one of those mechanics is that if the government spends more than it taxes, if G is greater than T, then that literally turns up as part of the actual definition of GDP. And when people are saying T should be greater than G because they want to pay down the level of government debt relative to GDP, by trying to get tax being greater than government, they're actually not just reducing the numerator of that ratio, they're reducing the denominator as well. So these attempts to reduce government debt to GDP ratio by the government taxing more than it spends actually ends up being potentially counterproductive on the ratio in the first place, because the numerator can fall the numerator falls precisely as much as your denominator falls as much as the numerator. Pardon me. Sometimes I get my bloody words mixed. Maybe I'm in Amsterdam too often.
It's a bit early in the morning to have been smoking stuff.
Your divisor is reduced as much as what you're trying to reduce on the top of the division sign. Boy, I have been here too long, haven't I? And that this is trying to keep up with your voice, mate. I blame you, basically. You talk too quickly, which is something I've never said to anybody else. So that's really quite a compliment. And what actually can happen is the circulation of money can slow down. And so what actually happens is by trying to cut government spending in the belief you're trying to reduce that government debt to GDP ratio, by cutting government spending, you actually directly cut GDP as well. And then also that can have secondary effects on the people finding there's less money around, try to hoard the money they do have, spend it more slowly. So your actual GDP in terms of expenditure on consumption investment can fall as well.
Yeah.
So the argument on that front from modern monetary theory is that the attempt to run a government surplus can be counterproductive just in terms of standard economic theory. But more importantly, what they argue is that if the government runs a surplus, then by definition, the private sector runs a deficit.
Yeah.
And this is where you're having to think in terms of at the aggregate level, different to the individual level, because at the individual level, if you try to spend less than you earn, you can save money. You can increase the amount of money in your bank account. But if we all try to save more than we earn, that is impossible because your expenditure is somebody else's income. So if you try to spend less, you are reducing somebody else's income, and there is no savings going on. The aggregate level of savings is zero.
Now, as always, there is a lot more to this discussion than you get in this free version of the podcast. If you want to hear the full half-hour version, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Choose one of the subscription options in the right-hand column, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. And if you provide $10 or more support for his work in changing the foundation of economics, which is quite a noble aim, you get the podcast thrown in for that as well. So go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, provide $10 or more support each month, and you get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. We'll be back again with another one very soon. Thanks for listening.